Hey guys, I just wanted to check in and kind of do a little quick lesson because so far you should have viewed those videos talking about our independent and dependent variables. And I want to kind of go over and just do a little lesson here, and I'll submit you some work so you can kind of work with me and then check what your answers are. Okay. So let's just take a look at these words while we start. And this should be a review, like we said. But if we have our independent and dependent, and do you see this word right here? That word is depend, right? So when I have my two variables is a fancy word for something that just they're talking about in the problem. When we've talked about our circles, our cubes, right? When we circle and we do our numbers in units, there will be our units as like our labels, and that will be the same thing. We're going to have two different labels or two different things we're talking about. And notice when we have our dependent, this depends on whatever this is talking about. And let's take a look at some of our examples. So this problem here says the more gallons of milk I have, the more cups of milk I can pour. I'm going to pause for a second and let's think about what we're talking about here. So we're going to circle, just like as if we were using cubes, what our units are, right? We don't have any numbers here, so we're just looking at that. So we're going to circle. What are our two variables? Okay, so how'd you do? So I have on here, I have the gallons of milk, and I kind of put some parentheses around it that I have, and I have cups of milk can pour, right? So now we have to decide. When I'm looking, does it, and we're going to use those words, right? Something depends on something. Does the gallons of milk depend on the cups of milk you can pour? Or does the number of cups of milk you can pour depend on how many gallons you have? So if you said that the number of cups you can pour depends on the number of gallons you have, you're absolutely correct, right? Because I'm going to pour a number of cups and I'm still going to have a number of gallons. That's going to keep going. How many cups I can actually pour depends. How much milk do I start with? Nice job. How'd you do? Okay, the next one, we're talking about some tacos, right? Brian is making tacos for a party. The number of tacos he makes will be determined by how many people attend the party. So let's circle. What would our two variables be here? So good. If you thought right away that we had the number of tacos he's making and we have how many here. So right away that that's a number, right? We've talked about that before. That's a keyword. The number of people to attend the party. Okay, so now we have to stop and think. Which one depends on the other? Does the number of tacos he makes depend on how many people attend the party? Or does how many people attend the party depend on how many tacos he makes? Good. If you said the number of tacos he makes depends on how many people come to the party, you got it right. And by the way, I forgot to mention, remember we called them variables, right? So when we talked about our variables, and variables are just our letters that stand for something, which is what we were talking about before, right? So in this case, I just made this P because I'm talking about number of people. I could have used the word guests and made it a G, but I figured I'd go with the words that were right there because, well, I didn't have to think about it then, right? And over here, I made this a little T that stands for tacos. And let's go back for a second because I did the same thing up here. When I said the number of gallons of milk, I made that G. And down here, I did the number of cups they can pour. So I made that C for like the cups. And our letters will come in more so later on in this unit, as well as for sure when we get into 7th grade. Okay, so we have another one. We have Malachi is building a case for his trophies. The number of trophies will determine how many shelves the case will need. So stop and think. What are the two things they're talking about here? You guessed it right. No, we have the number of trophies and we have how many, which is our words for number, right, of shelves. So those are my two. So now I'm going to stop when I decide. Does the number of shelves depend on the number of trophies, or does the number of trophies depend on the number of shelves? If you said the number of shelves depends on the number of trophies, you were correct. And notice I used my letters. I did T for trophies and S for shelves. And then we'll come in again, more important, as we do it later in this unit. So we're going to talk about a plant now, right? Every week, the plant grows 12 inches. Be careful on this because this one's a little bit different. Okay, so let's pause and stop for a second. What are the two variables? If you said weeks and inches, you were right. Now, if we're following what we do in class, we would circle. So I'm going to practice the same thing. So this is just circling what the variables are. If we're following our cubes in class, I would definitely be circling every, right? Because it's meaning one or each week, right? Same thing. And here I'd have 12 because that would be my number. So I just want to kind of stay the same way. So now we have to think about this. Does our number of weeks depend on how many inches the plant grows? Or does how many inches the plant grows depend on how many weeks we have? If you said the height of the plant, which is measured in inches, the height of the plant depends on the number of weeks, you are correct, right? Because every single week that passes, we get 12 inches. When 1 week passes, we have 12 inches. When the next week passes, we have 24 inches. And remember, we've kind of talked about this before. When we're talking about independent, most of the time, our independent is going to be anything that's talking about like time. Because remember, we said before, it'd be kind of weird if your calendar looked different than my calendar, or that looked different from one of your classmates' calendars, because our time depended on whatever our other variable is. No, our time just kind of keeps on going. What we do depends on how much time passes and things like that, okay? And remember the same thing here, because we're talking about weeks, we're using a W, and I'm talking about the height, I'm going to have an H. And remember, if I was using this, if I was reporting something, my H was standing for some number of inches. Okay, the next one I have, Patricia is 15 years older than her best friend, Jessica. Be careful because this one's a little bit different. What do you think the variables are? So if you said Patricia and Jessica, you're right. And in this case, when we're circling their names, we're really talking about how old they are. And this is one of those times where we talked about it's a little bit weird because it doesn't specifically say that in the problem. But we have to know when we say is years older than her best friend, we know we're talking about age here. When I'm talking about that, now this gets a little bit tricky because we have to look at the information they tell us. So we're talking about their ages. So now we have to take a look. Does when we report it, Jessica's age depend on Patricia's age, or does Patricia's age depend on Jessica's age? And I kind of want to point out something to you here when we're talking about that, because we're saying, right, Patricia's age is 15 years older than her best friend. So that should be a little bit of a cue too. Okay, if you said Patricia's age depends on Jessica's age, you're absolutely correct. Because if they told us nothing else from this problem, and if they just told us this, we would know that when Jessica is, however old Jessica is, we have to take Jessica's age and do plus 15 to come up with Patricia's. So we have no idea what anything is, but we know that in order to come up with Patricia's age, it's gonna depend on what Jessica's age is. Okay, let's talk about this one. It takes Doug 3.5 or 3.5 minutes to run each lap around the track. Well, there's something. If you didn't like running right now, right, there's your positive. You're not with Miss Heil or Mr. Helmanack, so you don't have to do any of like the pacers or things like that. Now, I do hope that you are doing some type of movement because it's good for our body and for our brain. So going back to our problem, it takes Doug 3.5 minutes to run each lap around the track. What do you think are my two variables here? I'll be very careful. if you said the number of minutes and the laps, the number of laps, you are correct. Now, notice I did the same thing as I did that last time. I included our numbers because if we're using our cubes, we do our numbers and our units, and each, remember, stands for 1. So sometimes it means division, but in this case, when it's in front of our variable or in front of our label or unit, right, that's going to mean 1. So for 1 lap, it takes him 3.5 minutes. So now we have to stop and think. Does the number of minutes depend on the number of laps he does? Or does the number of laps depend on the number of minutes? Okay, so this is kind of a weird problem, right? Because I told you about usually time is what it takes. If we were talking about that he ran at a specific pace and we asked how long would it take him, we would have it a little different. So this one can, and the way that this is worded, it could go either way. In this case, the number of minutes it takes him to do so many laps depends on how many laps it takes him. So this is kind of a little bit different because of taking a look at how depends on what they're doing, right? So the number of minutes it takes him depends on how many laps he goes. We kind of stop the time when he's done. So that's kind of the thing, because he's still going to keep on doing the laps. It just depends how many minutes that's going to, how long it takes him. Okay. How'd you do? I hope you did well. Remember, I'm more than willing to help explain it. And I'm putting another example in our classroom so you can have some more practice. And I'll put the video in so that you can check your answers.